Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. And before we kick off the session, please allow me to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. So I feel it's only appropriate to acknowledge up front that, yes, I am an engineer. Not the usual response I get. But probably, increasingly I see myself now as a reformed engineer. And to me, what that really means is I'm an engineer who understands actually that people exist, which was not something we got taught when I was actually at university. So look, a real pleasure to be here to chair the first panel session of today. And as you've heard, today we're going to be really focusing on how we integrate the energy system and people. And that's going to be building on, obviously, the really fascinating discussions and presentations that we heard yesterday. So to explore these weighty topics, I'm joined by a wonderful panel. So I'm going to eschew the very long introductions for each of our panelists because they are incredibly esteemed, but we would be here all morning. So I'll simply say we're welcoming to the panel Paul DeMartini, who we've already heard from this morning from the Newport Consulting Group, Jill Caney from Erna Energy, I hope that's the correct pronunciation, and also Clean Energy Council, Alex O'Mara from Sustainable Solutions Advisory, and Kirsty Gowans, who's joining us from DQ, the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment, and Water. I'm still getting used to the new acronyms. So the structure of the session this morning is going to follow the same structure as we've seen in the panel sessions yesterday. So after I sit down, each of the panelists will come up and sort of give you 5 to 7 minutes, their thoughts on the topic. We'll then engage in a bit of a discussion just for 15 minutes or so, and then we'll throw it open to the floor for all the questions that you have. And I noticed some of the questions that were coming up for Paul that we didn't actually get to explore. We can absolutely continue to explore those through this session. So really for the discussion that we're going to have now, we're going to be really focusing on the role that people and communities play in the design and operation of our energy system, particularly of the energy system that we're building into the future. And I think to frame this session, it's really interesting to reflect on where we've come from and where we're going. And so if you go back 60 years when we really built the energy system that we have today, we built a system that was powered by large central fossil fuel fired generators, and then the energy simply flowed out and was used at the edges of the grid. But where we're going is a radical transformation from that, because if we believe the current forecasts, and in many cases I believe those current forecasts are conservative, at least 50% of our generation and storage assets in the grid that we're building today is actually going to be connected in the distribution network. And overwhelmingly, it's going to be connected at people's homes. And so if you think about what that actually means in terms of how we think about the framing of our system, we've gone from a system that 60 years ago largely was a technical system and was operated as such. Then during the 90s, we bolted on a market, and so we thought of it as a techno-economic system. But now we actually have all of these consumer and distributed energy resources that are connected in the grid and largely represent energy infrastructure that supports the entire system. And that really requires us to have a socio-techno-economic framing. And if we're going to have a successful energy transition that ultimately puts people at the centre of our electricity system, we're actually going to have to work out what it means to have a socio-techno-economic framing and to design and operate an energy system that's actually consistent with that framing. And so hopefully that will set the scene for the discussion that we're about to have right now. And so I will get out of here and I will hand over to Jill, who's going to be the first panelist speaking up here. Thanks very much.
All right, good morning, everyone. So I'm part of the industry. I'm not an engineer. But some of us are very interested in about the fact that you need a potential difference to allow an electron to flow across a wire. But most of us don't just think about it. It's not that we don't want to think about it, it's completely irrelevant. We just want to get on with our lives. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story. It's about apples, not the techno kind, the fruity kind. This is a land where you need apples to do everything you want to do to live your life. There's a strong central market in apples. It's been around for a long time, just like Lachlan said. And Woolies operates the market. There are big orchards supplying the apples. There's delivery companies that get the apples to everyone that wants them. And then one day, somebody grew an apple tree in their garden, and they made their own apples. And they were excited about that. And they had some left over, and Woolies and the wider industry weren't too bothered about it. It was a bit quaint in a sort of Margot Ledbetter, Barbara and Tom, good life kind of way. But now 1 in 3 houses have apple trees in their gardens, and there are lots of excess apples flowing into the system. Of course, there are some people that don't have gardens and so can't grow apple trees, and that is a problem that we do have to look after. But these apples are not flowing through the industry's market. It's not going through their market, so what are they going to do? Some people who grow apples put the apples in a bucket and offer them to free to their neighbours. But they can't sell them to their neighbours because that's illegal. You have to be an official apple seller to sell apples in the market. However, whenever you carry your apples through the front door that you've picked up from your neighbour, you get charged. But you get charged for the full cost of the apple. So you get charged for the Woolies, the big orchard operator, the delivery. You have to pay for the full cost. Because this is how Woolies and the industry make their money. Now, obviously, apples are now leaving the house, and they're not getting charged, well, they weren't getting charged anything at all, but now there's an opportunity that you will have to pay to have your apples leave the house. And also, the system has now decided it would be quite a good idea to perhaps send the delivery company out to prune the apple trees. They won't kind of tell you about, they might tell you about it, they might not tell you about it. They'll do it for you for free, but it just manages the amount of apples that are going to come out through the front door. So I think I've stretched that analogy quite far. And I'd welcome anyone who's got any other crazy ideas about apples and cider and how that might apply to the electricity system. But I think when you talk about it as apples, it sounds quite bonkers, doesn't it? It sounds really silly. And so the problem is that we're not thinking about tariffs and flexibility services, and it doesn't have to be that way, particularly the pruning. I'm very upset about the pruning. So in the UK, the regulator has required the delivery companies, the networks, to share their data openly, all of their data. That allows, and the regulator's view is that allows new, exciting, innovative companies to discover new ways to do things that will deliver benefits to customers. UK networks, just as Paul was talking about in the US, are developing flexibility services. And in January, UK Power Networks, which is the network that looks after sort of like the East Anglia, London and Kent bit of the UK, put out a tender for 500 megawatts of flexibility. And this is provided from the demand side. UKPN have saved over £400 million in investing in new network infrastructure by spending £40 million on flexible services from the demand side. We're not really exploring flexibility services in Australia. We're either doing pruning and we're trying to do tariffs, but it's not necessarily working the way we want. And also National Grid this winter in the UK has used the demand side to manage capacity in a tightening market because of the the Ukraine and Russia situation. So yes, we should be walking on the demand side, like Lynn says, but the industry and system is walking on the wild side because they see community energy resources and customers as wild, out of control animals that need to be corralled and penned in, rather than embracing consumer energy resources and customers as essential to reach emissions and renewable targets. And I just want to finish with a number here that in 2021, Australians, us, we put 3.3 gigawatts of rooftop solar on our homes. And in 2022, AEMO said that we put 2.9 gigawatts of large-scale renewable generation into the NEM. I'd like you to think about who is winning the battle of addressing emissions and renewable energy, and why we're not really thinking about that group of people as critical to our future.
Thanks very much, Jill. I invite Alex to come and make a few remarks now.
Hello, it's lovely to be here to talk to you all today. My career has been around the interface between sort of place and planning and energy systems. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about today, which is really about, when you think about the two transitions, so the transition away from fossil fuels to net zero, and then the sort of demand side, are we really taking the opportunity to transform our communities and our places that's there for the taking? And what I'd encourage us to think about is, do all the solutions come from the energy space, or do we need to think more broadly in terms of the opportunity here? If you think about the ECA's consumer sentiment survey that went out last year, only 35% of households think that the market's acting in their long-term interests, dropped by 11% last year. Huge opportunity to get this transition right, but for me the transition is as much social as it is economic or environmental. And we're standing, I think, on the edge of a huge opportunity to think more broadly. And are we going to realise that opportunity? So one of the pieces of work I've been doing with the ECA is looking at the opportunity with the transmission infrastructure rollout, so really, I suppose, coming from the supply side, to look at, can energy justice thinking and place-based approaches give you an opportunity to take a different pathway forward? And I suppose I'm interested in that because I've worked around social licence for such a long time. I know how difficult it is. And what's interesting to me is that there's really broad consensus that social licence is a critical enabler for that transition. We all agree on that. But such a great question from Fiona Haynes, Professor Fiona Haynes, around who determines when a social licence has been granted. And I suppose looking at this, think, if we approach social licence through an instrumental lens where it's like something you extract, like a tooth, we're just not going to get there, you know. But and I think there's so many great conversations, lots of stuff happening at many levels of government. What's interesting is the consensus, I think, from all players that we need to think differently about social licence and how we do transmission infrastructure expansion. Whatever amount of that there is, and I understand that there's huge debate in this room about how much of that is necessary, but assuming we have to do some of it. I was at a lunch last week with a senior person in the energy space who said the kitchen table conversation about transmission infrastructure is the hardest one to have. Nobody wants transmission infrastructure in their backyard, right? And so why is energy justice important? Well, there's this fantastic academic called Al Marlow who says, what we need to avoid is people feeling like their places are sacrifice zones. We don't want to be saying to parts of our community, you have to take one for the team. I think we can be more creative than that. And energy justice is interesting because very quick run through. So distributional justice, is there a spatial impact? And absolutely there is with transmission infrastructure. There's also this piece around recognition justice and procedural justice. So who gets to be part of that conversation? And, you know, huge opportunity around, for example, First Nations communities to enable them to be part of that conversation and to really benefit from that transition. But if we're not careful, we'll rush to roll it out and we'll miss that opportunity. So I suppose my provocation is, well, are we thinking broadly enough? When you think about why communities are upset about transmission infrastructure expansion, it's usually not to do with energy. So if we come up with solutions that are only about energy or even sort of economics, we're not really responding to what they're upset about. So I would say place-based solutions are a really great way to start. And what's so interesting is when you think about RESs, they are fundamentally place-based solutions. And we're about to roll them out across the eastern seaboard. But are we thinking, if we think about RESs just as an energy solution, the kind of opportunity to address what the community is concerned about and to enable a positive transition, I think, is missed. So, for example, I would say more to do on genuine engagement with communities. The conversation needs to be broader. I know Rebecca Huntley was here yesterday. Absolute, love Rebecca and her stuff around how to talk to communities about climate change in a way that makes a difference. And rather than starting with science and facts, starting with, well, what they love about their place and why we need to transition and what that is going to mean for that place if we don't. And then engaging them in the solution, because then they'll own it, you know? I mean, I recognise that this is different and I probably sound a bit Pollyanna-ish, but I do think there's opportunities to embrace a broader approach to this. And I think, to Paul's point, allowing community to take a stronger sense of ownership and leverage this incredible momentum that's in the community already. You know, so if you think about Electrify 2515, or even in, you know, Orange, for example, there's a community battery program that's kind of funded by the community. There's a lot of excitement around what we can do, and I think also a lot of fear around what climate change is going to mean for people. How do you empower them as part of this conversation to shape that future? And I think, for example, if you think about the amount of money that's going to be flowing into these areas, renewable energy zones, for example, does it give you an opportunity to crack the nut of social and affordable housing because you're going to get a long-term investment stream over 20 years? So what can the energy transition offer that community that maybe goes beyond energy? I suppose that's my question to this room. And I think really interesting examples from government, so genuine opportunity to engage. If you think, for example, I think one of the most interesting documents that's come out in the last year is the Central Westarana First Nations guidelines, which essentially are arguing for a place-based approach. So interesting, starting with what that community thinks is important. And if you think about Arnie Joan and what she said yesterday in the Welcome to Country about we need to respect our place and what does respect look like, wouldn't it be interesting if we started with a holistic approach to place that was informed by what that community thought mattered? I think there have been examples in other sectors of people trying to do that. So, for example, there's this process underway in Tasmania called the Islander Way, looking at essentially over-tourism on Flinders Island. And what's interesting about that is the conversation started about the impacts on that island from too many tourists. But what the process uncovered was that to solve that, the community needed to look more broadly at things like waste and energy and, you know, so really enabling a broader conversation. The other really great example I've seen is the local decision-making framework in New South Wales, which again came out of the Ochre Plan. Yeah. And what's interesting about that was, again, the Aboriginal community articulating what they wanted, but again, forcing the government to kind of come together, and rather than the agencies responding in their silos, trying to bring an integrated approach, not new money, just reprioritising services. So I'm going to finish with a quote from Mariana Mazzucato, who talks about government and the need to take a mission-based approach. That the energy transformation is not just about renewable energy. It's about a cross-sectoral approach to innovation through a diverse portfolio of projects. And that it's only about thinking big and differently that we will create value and hope. So my challenge to us is, how do we do that?
Thanks very much, Alex. I'll invite Paul to make his remarks.
I'll build on the thought about how we engage communities and consumers and other stakeholders more broadly into the planning process. Obviously has been discussed. It's an important component. As I touched on, this has increasingly been occurring. It largely started as a result in the US because of the resilience discussions, but it has broadened out into thinking more holistically around consumer adoption of consumer energy resources and their needs. As it relates to resilience, one of the things, as I touched on, is that many cities and even smaller towns, counties, and states themselves had to develop resilience plans through their state emergency services agency or the like. There was a crossover into the energy sector. So one of the challenges that we've had in the US, I don't know how applicable this is, but we have a separate entity that deals with emergency services at a state level. We have a separate entity that may deal with sort of energy policy, and then we have a separate regulator typically of the utility. And so each of those entities have to really come together as well. And then not just at the state level, but then they hadn't necessarily been always engaged at the city or town or county level. So in many ways, we had sort of three levels of agencies from town, county, state that needed to collaborate, as well as then the various community folks that deal with these issues and have advocacy positions in terms of representing their various communities. In addition, not unlike yourselves, we have Native American tribal governments that in the US, as you may not know, are actually separate entities from the federal government. So they're their own sovereign nations, and they have their own government, and they also need to be engaged effectively as part of this process. So that really got a lot of the conversations going. And as I touched on, a lot of the resilience solutions are around how do we provide resilient power when the broader system is out, or even large parts of the distribution network is out. And so conversations around microgrid or backup power and the like, and that conversation sort of expands into a broader discussion with the utilities, the network providers and others about how we might create more holistic solutions, not just for specific point needs like a single facility that may be the emergency facility, but also what about the police, fire, hospital, and so on, and can we think more broadly about how this might approach. This has continued over the last couple of years to start to fold into regulation where, for example, in California, the utilities, the network providers in California now are required to actually put a community engagement plan together as part of their planning process that reaches out to the various communities. And you can imagine in California, so, it's a fairly large state, not obviously as large as Australia, but large population, 30-some million people. And so getting out to all these little towns and communities and hearing what their needs are and factoring that into the process is something that's increasingly recognized as a needed thing. In Hawaii, Hawaiian Electric, who I also do work for, they've been doing this now for several years where they started out with something called the Resilience Working Group that kind of built off what the state did in terms of looking overall across all critical infrastructure sectors, and then started to tie in with just narrowing on the electric sector, but brought in those same folks into that conversation, added in some climate science and looking at forecasted weather patterns to look at and start to prioritize areas of interest. There's a nice report that they have that's online, and I can share that with folks if you're interested. And that process has continued. So they just finished going out to each of the islands. They serve 5 of the islands, and they've gone out to each of the islands and had community meetings to better understand what the needs were. This was also done at the same time, interesting, as when they were also looking at developing a renewable energy zone on Oahu, where Honolulu is. And then the discussion about, as you can imagine, kind of touched on, is the consumers there and the community's like, well, what's in it for us? Can we benefit from the energy coming off these systems, even though the large-scale renewables were to support the whole island? Part of that discussion started to lead into some additional conversation about what else could be done in addition in that zone that could support that community's needs as well. So it opened up a conversation that probably wouldn't have otherwise happened. Don't know where this is going to end up, but this sort of conversation is the kind of thing that we're starting to see increasingly. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. And we'll invite Kirsty to finish off with her remarks. And I can see plenty of questions coming in already, but please, we'll definitely be taking questions from below the fold once I get the iPad. So please keep your questions coming in for what's next.
Thanks, Lachlan. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this country as well, and other Aboriginal people who might be here today, or First Nations people who might be here today. And also thank you very much for the invitation to come and talk to you, and in particular to listen to all of the speakers here today talking about such a really interesting and important subject. So my name's Kirsty Gowans, and I've actually very recently been appointed the Head of Division for Electricity at DECU, Climate Change, Environment and Water. So I actually only started on the 31st of January, so I hope you'll forgive me if I don't have all of the answers that you're looking for, particularly today. But what I thought I could possibly add some value by sharing is how the government and the ministers sort of approaching some of these issues now. And that has been a very interesting experience for me. Over the last 7 months, I've been working on the standing up of the government's Rewiring the Nation policy, and I've had responsibility for the First Nations Clean Energy Strategy with Candice Asma, who's here with me today, and also for social licence. That's not a term that really appeals to me as an idea, and for many years I worked in a past job at the Northern Land Council and did a lot of negotiation of mining, and there was a lot of talk of social licensing, and it gives you this sort of idea that you could somehow going to get a ticket and that's going to make everything okay. But from my perspective, what we really need in relation to this energy transition is actually a sense of trust and empowerment and community ownership and engagement of what this process is really all about. It comes from that real point about what kind of society we want to be at the end of this. The minister is very clear. He doesn't think of it as a transition. He doesn't think of us as transitioning from fossil fuels, for example, to renewable energy, although that's a really important part of this. He thinks of it as an energy transformation. And when he talks about that, what I hear him talking about is the capacity of this change to transform us as a society and a community, and put ourselves into a position, a future that we can all see ourselves in and part of. So we think of it as a transformation that it started with energy in a lot of ways, because the energy transformation is so critical to achieving our climate goals and achieving our Paris commitments. But this transformation is every bit as much now being powered and accelerated by the choices that we're all making as individuals, not just as consumers, but also as citizens who are pursuing a whole range of different interests in our own individual households and communities across Australia. So I think from the Commonwealth point of view, the first sort of thing that people have been thinking about is what's the role of the Commonwealth in the energy transformation? What's the job that we need to be doing? And I think what we think we need to be doing, aside from listening to what other people think we should be doing, is catalysing and bringing together people in a partnership to be working on these kind of problems. And the first thing that the government really did was to establish the National Energy Transformation Partnership. And the purpose of that is not just to talk about what we're doing, but to talk about how we're doing it and how we're working together to come up with the solutions to what is a fascinating but very complicated and very challenging set of tasks. So that sense about not just what we're doing, but how we're doing extends very much to how the government wants to work with consumers and all sorts of citizens and other environmental groups and others in relation to building trust and building support for the transformation that we need. So it's not just support for individual projects, for transmission or for an offshore wind zone. It's really for the fact that we're going to fundamentally change our society and we need to have support built in to where we're going to be and what we are creating together in doing that. So from our perspective, we're very focused on engaging with people and listening to people's points of view. And when we think about social licence, or the way we see it is how do we build support for the energy transformation and the social transformation that will come from that, then there are so many factors to that, because it's really interesting to hear the similarities with the US, about all the many factors that could lead to our communities supporting a particular change or not, or individual people or households or consumers supporting a change or not. And so for us, there are many strategies to achieve that, but one of the key strategies is actually to work in partnership with the people and communities that are impacted by particular changes. And so essentially that's the fundamental way that we are trying to approach it. It's a huge task to be engaging with so many voices and so many ideas, but it's very interesting. And I know that there's just a continuous communication between jurisdictions, between governments, between stakeholders, advocacy groups and consumer groups about the best way that we can approach that. So we're certainly looking at putting our Commonwealth resources into programs and policies that can build that kind of support for the transformation that's being made. And we're also looking at how we can use our influence, our voice, our leadership role to catalyse support for particular things that we think are in the national interest. I think we don't think that we're going to achieve 10,000 kilometres of transmission by bulldozing over people's views, whether they be landowners, whether they be First Nations communities, or whether they be consumers. But we do think that we can bring additional value, because the energy transformation can bring value in many, many ways. It's not just, as you say, it's not just about changing the source of power or two-way power or any of those sort of things. It can fundamentally change how we all live, and we hope that at the end of it, we're going to be a society that we're all really happy and feeling prosperous and more fulfilled to be part of. So that's it from me. I might hand back to you, Lachlan.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, look, now we definitely get to move into the fun part for me of the panel session, which is Q&A. And so there's plenty of great questions coming in. I'm going to take the chair's prerogative to have a couple of questions here, and then we'll engage in a discussion between now and 11 o'clock when we will get you out on time for morning tea. So I'm going to take us back to where Jill started us, because honestly, I thought that Apple analogy was absolutely a fantastic way of sort of highlighting the transition that is ultimately underway. And I think within the energy sector, we have a tendency to look to the energy sector for solutions. And so, it started off in Australia trying to look, in Australia for energy solutions or transition solutions. We've now started at least to look overseas in the energy sector. But societal transformation actually occurs across many different sectors, not just in energy. And so where I thought we might start would just be if the panel could maybe talk about other societal transformations that we've gone through, and if there's any lessons we can learn from them to support the current energy transition. Jill, I know you're burning to give us an example.
So I guess we we've talked before, but one of the big transitions that many of us probably don't remember because we're too young was decimalisation. So when we moved from pounds, shillings and pence to wherever, farthings and wherever, to what we have now. And also in weights and measures. And that was in Australia, I think in 1965, before I was born. 66, okay, I stand corrected. And, and that required a huge effort to move us from one set of currency to another set of currency, but it covered lots of other things, you know, stamps, postage, how do you convert from pounds, shillings and pence to pounds and pence? And then that flowed through into weights and measures. So we didn't use pounds and ounces anymore. We used kilograms and grams. And that's a big transition. And the government had a huge program here to move us along. Do we need something similar for this energy transition?
And Kirsty, maybe that's a good way to bring you in. I mean, does government think about, you know, looking at past successful transitions? And, you know, definitely we sort of see ourselves on one side of the transition now, but we have survived these transitions and we've done so and thrived on the other side of it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I don't think I would see us at the beginning of the transition. I think we're well into this transformation now, and it's going faster and faster the way a lot of these things do. You know, they start quite slowly. It's almost, you know, push the snowball up to the top of the hill, but once it starts rolling down the other side, you've got to run to keep up. And I honestly feel like that's where we are. So government definitely looks at other, you know, fundamental, profound changes in society. The one I probably think of is probably the adoption of all the digital technologies, and I think the extent to which that's changed how we live is really quite a lot. Like I saw the question, you know, is society going to fundamentally change? And I think the answer is yes, it is. It isn't just going to be that, you know, we stop using the phone that's plugged into the wall and start using our mobile phone. It's changed the way we live and interact and engage with each other and how we consume media and, you know, who we engage with and interact with, and made products available that we couldn't have even imagined at the time when that digital change took place. And you can still read, you know, funny, amusing sort of memes about people who thought that the computer would never take off. I think this change is going to be just as fundamental and just as profound, and it will change the way we engage with energy.
Absolutely. Alex or Paul, any examples you'd like to share?
Well, the one we're living in right now is what happened with the pandemic and the remote work capability, and the fact that we're rethinking what work looks like. And, you know, my daughter still is working remote. She moved. She was headquartered in San Francisco. Now she's down in Southern California working, and she has no plans to go back. You know, housing costs and so on. A lot of people moved out of the cities. It was only, you know, if you'd have talked to anybody 5 years ago or more, the whole discussion was the urbanization of the population, particularly in the US, but even elsewhere. Everybody was moving to the cities. And then that seems to have completely reversed in a matter of a couple of years. And I don't think we've really completely understood the impact of that. And I think that's also going to have a profound effect on how we think about the energy system supporting, because there was a lot of policies around things like transportation-oriented planning and urbanization that sort of was how do we optimize where people live, work, commute, you know, and then live their lives, and now that's gone, you know, back out of the cities, and so I think there's more to be learned from there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose I'm sort of thinking more in terms of like renewable energy zones and like physical impacts of the transition. And, you know, so I suppose like one of the things to learn from it, you know, are things like transport infrastructure and the way that's done and how that's fractured communities. And, you know, is there a way to do that in a different way? Because I suppose to me, unless you you look at the opportunity to bring economic and social and environmental together, you are missing an opportunity here. And of course you could decide, well, we're not going to do that, we don't have time. But I think that would be a missed opportunity. Yeah.
Look, I think it's probably interesting to talk to the elephant in the room. We talk a lot about sort of the addition of social to how we think about framing this transition. And so I am going to go to social license, because I think it's really important to talk about, how do we get it, but also how do we know that we've got it? And once we know we've got it, what can we then do with it? So I think linking to the first question that you can see that's come through around kind of community groups, how do we get social license effectively? Potentially, what is the role of community groups in doing that? And how do we actually know we have social license?
That's actually been one of the things we've been thinking about. How do we know when we've got social license? Because we don't think of social license as being a lack of opposition or a lack of complaints. That you can get a lack of complaints partly because people have lost confidence that their complaint would be dealt with, so therefore deterred. So we have been really thinking about that, and in fact we have a behavioural scientist working with us to look at some of the work that's been done internationally on that. But in terms of how do we know, we think we're going to have to do some sort of sentiment monitoring, and then thinking about that and how to do that. We're still fairly early days on that, but to measure people's trust and people's confidence and people's support for the transformation to net zero as a whole, including the infrastructure and energy parts of that.
So I kind of think, do you ever get social license? Is it a single point in time where you say, tick, we've got it, we can park that now and progress happily off into the future? I think it's a constantly evolving thing, and what you might want, what society might want today is not going to be the same in a few years' time. So it's going to change. The community will change. They will respond and adapt to what's happening. So it's not a fixed point.
And I talked to the minister about it like a game of snakes and ladders. There are ladders, which are things that can take you further ahead in terms of building social license, like good communications, strong community engagement, proper planning processes that integrate environmental concerns, those sorts of things. They're ladders. On the other hand, there are snakes. Go back 3 spaces, lose social license because, for example, you went through the orange parrot habitat or something like that in your wind farm. So I think you're in a constant state of this process where you can gain points and you can lose points by different ways that you behave. But it's important that governments keep progressing towards gaining the confidence and support, and managing the risk of losing it by proper, effective strategies.
I think it's fundamentally about respect, and how do you have conversations with communities or community energy groups in a way that's I think a lot of communication from government, and I can say this as someone who worked in government for a long time, is that sometimes we don't do that with enough respect, and sometimes we anchor the conversation in science and facts rather than starting with what matters here and listening. And often, working for ministers, they can have very ambitious timeframes, things have got to be done, and that means that it can be difficult to have those real conversations, real relationships. But to me, it's kind of, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. I suppose I just look at those renewable energy zones and think that is a real opportunity to take a different approach, to pilot something fresh that's about an ongoing relationship. And, a lot of governments would say, oh, we're all about partnerships, we're all about engagement, but actually seeing that on the ground would be really exciting, I think. And I suppose I just look at the levels of trust in government and think, well, that to me is a fundamental. That's sort of when we talk about social licence, to me it's really around trust. Do people believe that, industry or government is actually going to do what they're saying they're going to do? And that's a hard thing to get right, and it's great to have people like Kirsty in the mix,
Can I maybe just sort of drill in a little bit on this? Because I think, to Jill's point, it's interesting that, you don't really get social license, and trust is something that is built and maintained over time. we hear, obviously, from lots of reports that people have been talking about in the last couple of days, and ECA does a lot of this. Trust is at a pretty low ebb in the energy system. So, I mean, what are we going to have to do on a sustained basis, and who is going to have to do it on a sustained basis to actually rebuild that trust in the energy sector and in government if they're now going to be delivering significant energy policy?
Well, again, I think it's government, and I also think it's industry. I think it's like, rather than saying, on the IOP2 spectrum, like, we're going to try and edge further along that. Well, you could edge further along that. You could say, well, we're going to make a commitment to do this, to have a deliberative process, to follow through on what we say we're going to do. I mean, all these things have costs, don't they? I mean, but I think it's actually about state government, local government, federal government, industry. Like, we all need to move differently. I think local government's really interesting in this context. Like, if you look at what they say, they're often trying to walk that line between, we want the investment, we get the jobs are really important, but we know the community's really upset. So how can you sort of see that as a lever and empower them to work with state and local government? I mean, I think the best way, my experience in government is the best way to drive change is to sort of pilot something fresh and, see if it works and then build from there. And when I look at the reses, I think, well, that is the perfect opportunity to do something different that might enable, a broader approach, which is often very hard for government to do. It's very hard to get lots of agencies who have different priorities, so housing or health or whatever it is, to kind of work together, but often that's what the community is really seeking. And I know, for example, they've tried a lot of this in Wales. Interesting, isn't it? The Welsh are so far in front in terms of wellbeing. They've got a Wellbeing Act. All their public services are kind of anchored around that. But yeah, I think they tried some really innovative stuff around place-based approaches that seem to work really well.
So I'm going to say, and be very, very frank, that it's the language that the industry uses. So in the last month, I've sat in industry meetings with representatives from the market bodies and various other organisations, and the language about customers is very disappointing. It's not, we need system security is often used as a catch-all for, we've got to do something and we're going to use system security as the excuse, and customers are going to have, so I've heard customers are going to have to like it or lump it. We don't want to open the can of worms, whereas I think we should absolutely be opening the can of worms there, a bit squirmy.
They go with your apples.
They go with the apples, and maybe some of your apples will, but it's not maggots, so worms not too bad. But we're not going to progress unless we're using inclusive language that is genuinely centred on the customer. If you're talking about, well, this is inevitable, this physics thing is inevitable, and customers are just going to have to accept it, then you're not
really listening.
You're not really listening, you're not really genuinely engaging, and it's more about incrementally fiddling around the edges to keep the status quo as it is.
Yeah. And I suppose the community batteries thing, I mean, things like that are really interesting, aren't they? Like, that's an opportunity for communities to kind of,
We might come back to community batteries. I think where I'd like to jump off to now is this, this notion of actually, understanding what people and communities actually want. And, we hear a lot about sort of new technologies, and we're going to be electrifying everything, and we're going to roll out lots of assets, and everyone's going to have an app and all the rest of it. But it strikes me as someone who's, built pieces of those technology that I didn't actually enjoy using them. And that the light switch still kind of remains my preferred way of interacting with the electricity system. So, maybe for the panel, can we talk about not the hype, but the reality of what do people and householders actually want when we're thinking about the energy transition?
I think it's very hard. So some of the conversations I've been having are, I might say, I think your idea is crazy, whichever crazy idea it is, and I'm talking about market body rule changes, not customers, because customers never have crazy ideas. But, you know, it's crazy and it just can't happen. And so we need to be more open to things. And the idea that, well, customers don't really know what they want yet. They didn't know when they were riding horses that they'd want cars, but when we gave them cars, they loved cars. And that's kind of the similar conversation we had yesterday about the mobile phone. Nobody knew that they wanted a mobile phone, but now they love them. And they didn't know they wanted apps, they didn't know they wanted to live their life through a mobile phone. So there's a sense in the regulatory space and the energy framework space that customers don't really know what they want, and so we've just got to give them what we think they want, but nobody's really articulated what that is, and nobody's really spoken to customers, which are a huge diverse group, to find out what it is that they want. And can we really assume that this is the same as horses to cars or landlines to mobiles? Is it the same?
Paul, I might come to you on this. I mean, from a US perspective, is there a perspective in the US on what customers actually want?
Well, I think there's a realization. Let's take thermostats, for example. 10 years ago, the idea of a smart thermostat was something when we had demand response programs, to have customers not use their air conditioning during, hot days. You would have to provide that thermostat to a customer for that, and they would sign up and they would get paid to participate during that summer. We don't talk about that anymore. The conversation in the US is this concept, I don't know if you have this here as well, it's called BYOD. It's bring your own device. And the idea is, well, the customer's already buying these because they're buying them for convenience. They're buying them for how they want comfort in their home. Now the question is there a way to tap into that automation in a non-intrusive way to harvest some of the potential energy savings when the customer's not there, to be able to utilize that for flexibility services for the system, either at the bulk power system or at the distribution level. And so that's the conversation. The issue is we haven't resolved the parameters under which that's acceptable, so the social license to automate, if you will, because we've had instances over the last year and a half, both in extreme cold and extreme hot issues in Texas and also in Colorado, where those thermostats were bricked, meaning they got stuck at a certain temperature, and the house in the extreme cold got below what is healthy, temperatures inside the home. And conversely, they got bricked when it was super hot, 110 degrees or over 40 Celsius, and those homes inside got unhealthy, and so people started to complain. We haven't worked out those parameters around how you would do that and really understand from consumers what's acceptable on that level. We talk about value proposition, but the value proposition for a customer needs to be beyond just some monetary. It needs to be the whole. What we're working on, one of the things I'm working on at the moment, is actually a code of conduct, kind of borrowing from the UK model, but it's focused on this idea of how do we address the risk factors that consumers think about when they buy a product. This is well understood in consumer product marketing. Consumers have about 6 different risk factors that they think about in the decision making about whether they get a product. Part of it has to do with, will it do what I think it's going to do for what I'm buying? And there's things that touch on, for example, safety and health concerns, depending on what the product is. And that's obviously a factor here that maybe wasn't thought about before, but certainly consideration. So I think because we're so early in this, I think we're in the learning phase. Unfortunately, we're having some instances that are bringing the learnings a lot quicker and maybe more poignant. But I think we're going to get there, sooner than later around this, because there's a big push in the U.S. To try and tap into this sort of harvesting, automated flexibility, but it's going to come with a need for a deeper understanding, this sort of empathetic approach to really understanding what will really work for various customers.
And I think, I mean, you've just talked about harvesting, and I can't help but think of the apples. And so I'm gonna go to the question, the top question here. I mean, we can all give examples of kind of attempts at flexibility that have gone terribly in the last couple of years globally. But are there examples where flexibility services have gone really, really well? And bonus points if you can relate it to apples in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, well, this past summer, obviously in California, we had some planning miscues, and we didn't quite know as much demand there was going to be during the summer when we had the heat waves come through. And so we had generation shortfalls, and so there was a need to tap into consumers' willingness to conserve during those periods. Fairly significant amounts of conservation that happened. That was sort of in this emergency mode, but as we think about this on a more regular basis, we are seeing early pilots and demonstrations of some scale. Thermostats are one, but the other is because we have a fairly large number of battery being installed, that ends up being a pretty effective device to the extent that it's there, because it typically doesn't impact the consumer in terms of their lifestyle. And there's a way to tap into that for the benefit of the system on an effective and reasonable value proposition for the consumer to use that. In California, we have 1,000 megawatts of consumer batteries that are being looked to tap into. So 1 gigawatt is pretty significant, although in the scheme of things, I think California's peak is somewhere in the 50 to 60 gigawatts, so it's still relatively small, but it's growing. In Hawaii, the battery adoption, because of the way they changed the tariffs to encourage battery-paired solar systems, they have a much greater amount of that, and they are tapping into that pretty effectively.
So I think was it Rebecca yesterday was saying that you don't have to pay people to deliver flexibility. So there have been some instances here in Australia when, you know, it's been a tweet. We're facing a difficult situation tonight. Please, can you turn your aircon down? And that works. And also, I guess Lynn likes hot water tanks. I love hot water tanks too. They're very rare because we've all gone to continuous hot water. But that's a fantastic energy store, and there are tariffs. As there are in the UK and the US, there are tariffs here in some locations, network tariffs, that, you know, allow the network to manage hot water services, aircon and pool pumps. And that was very important in a Queensland instant.
Yeah. I think
The Collide instance. So that's kind of, so...
Yeah. The distinction we've been looking at is emergency is one, but if the emergency is every day for 4 hours, then we have to think about a different value proposition than just the societal contribution.
When we did trials when I was at Arena looking at demand response, and we didn't find that people responded particularly to monetary signals. In fact, the community signal was actually a lot stronger. But in the end, I think it'll be impossible to know what consumers want, because consumers are individuals and there's billions of us and we all want different things, and we're not just consumers. We're citizens and we are consumers as well. So I think that the pursuit of learning what a consumer wants is, we're searching, you know, it's El Dorado sort of situation. What we need to have is a situation where people can make choices in an environment of confidence. So things that are true to label, you know, things that are offering things that individuals want or need. At the moment, the energy system is impenetrable. It is impossible to make a decision about what you want. It's like that ridiculous situation when you're buying a plane ticket and all the seats are exactly the same and they all cost different amounts. And there's no difference between what you're getting, which is a seat on a plane. The only difference is, the only thing that would moderate you other than the price is the time. But the truth is there are all these prices of fares and you get all these ridiculous services added on. Do you want to choose your seat? No, I just want to get from Sydney to Brisbane, you know. So I really think one of the issues is that I think probably people would agree on is that it's very hard to make consumer choices in an environment where the information is so poor.
I'd
But
agree.
as for what we want, we should all make our own choice. But at the moment, I don't know. I personally couldn't make a choice most of the time. I have no idea what most of these tariffs are, and the conversations about tariffs makes no sense. Yeah.
I mean, I think Paul Jordan
So-
was so interesting on that. Yesterday with his, like the heat plants and things like that, where, you know, it was really flipping it to, well, like rather than I'm buying so many gigawatts, I'm buying a warm home, and this is the kind of like a mobile plan almost. I thought, oh, that is really...
And see, that's another product with an impenetrable thing.
But
you
at
know?
least it's kind of, I know what I'm getting, like I at least have some choice about, like, I suppose it's more of an outcome-based approach. I think that's interesting, isn't it? How do you shift from the input to the service you're getting as a result?
One of the really interesting things I remember from Arena was just a particular day where people were just doing the innovation lab sort of process, and the premise of the lab was, what if you don't charge for energy, you charge to supply the load on the basis that the energy will be cost neutral? And then what would that mean, you know? And it was just such a fascinating conversation, because it was all about flipping on its head, what is the thing that is valuable? So if sunlight is creating electricity, then electricity is, you know, free and available. What is it that you're selling that has value? So it was quite an interesting sort of conversation. But, you know, and I think sometimes in energy, you know, you've got all the tribes, you've got the market people and the boffins and the modelers and the, you know, and the engineers, lovely though they are, and you've got the lawyers and the regulators, and it's like being in a school where there's all these sort of cool tribes and groups. But at the end of the day, a lot of the questions we're trying to answer, they might not be the right questions, because fundamentally what we're talking about is how we create value for people and how they can participate in ways that enhance their life, and that'll be many, many, many different things for many people.
I think just on the tribes thing, I think it is interesting. One of the tribes we probably don't talk about as much of is the role of social scientists.
And the government tribe. Forgot about us.
And I think just worth pointing out that social science, particularly energy social science in Australia, is really an emerging discipline, and this is one of the few fora where we actually do get huge numbers of energy social scientists contributing. And so I think,
Sorry.
great credit. No, great credit.
I forgot a tribe, which is pretty bad.
Sorry, I'm not responding to that. I think it's just really important that actually, if we're going to have a socio-techno-economic framing of it, we recognise the role that social scientists will play. And I know Lynn and ECA have played a really important role, as has Arena actually, in funding trials that actually have a lot of social scientists. So I think it's probably an interesting point to now actually go to the top question. And so I've been watching this question fly up as people liked it. So I mean, what does it actually mean to put consumers at the centre of it, and what does it mean in practice? And sort of the engineering me really with what are the pragmatic things that we're going to do to put people at the centre of our electricity system? And the panel will now provide answers to that question.
Well, as I mentioned in the planning process, it starts with understanding the consumers first. Obviously, you've got public policies that are, feed into the planning objectives and criteria, but equally so, if not more importantly, is understanding what consumers that you're serving, what their interests are, and then the communities as well. And really factoring that in and developing what those planning criteria are for what you're trying to do. We're very much focused on objective-based planning processes, and so getting those objectives right, because what you put into the process is going to really inform what comes out the other end. Sort of building on the ladders we're creating, we better make sure what we put into that is reflective of what the needs are, and better understanding that. I think that's what we're seeing happening, and I think I tried to provide a few examples of that.
So I think for me, it's about, we've just heard that it's complicated. We did an exercise yesterday where we had an island and a sea of incoming problems, and my island was overpopulated. I had too many tribes. I hadn't even disaggregated the people in my tribes. And so I felt like, it was time to vote a few people off the island. Perhaps we needed to cull a few people on the island. But anyway, because it's just so complex.
Yeah.
So how can you have an industry or a solution that's centred on customers when customers can't understand anything about the system? You know, I talked to people yesterday who want to do community energy. They want to be able to sell apples to their neighbours and to their community. You just can't do it. And every time I've asked in the UK and in Australia why, I get some, well, it's just not the way we do it, Jill. Our regulatory frameworks are like this. And they're like some, you know, they're a straitjacket that are sometimes I think customers should be like the Incredible Hulk. I'm imagining, you know, that point where the Hulk transitions and the shirt bursts off, and I'm imagining that's what customers want, with the regulatory shirt kind of bursting out and consumers taking over. But how can you navigate something you don't understand? It's like giving people, saying, people, you need to get to destination A, and there's like, you don't know where the ravine is, you don't know where the river is, you don't know where the highway, you know nothing. You've got to, I suppose it's another reality show, it's Survivor. You're just kind of plonked somewhere and expected to get to the destination with no understanding of what's going on.
Well, Lynn, I think we've got some examples for next year's Foresighting Forum.
Yeah.
Survivor for the energy market bodies. Featuring the Hulk.
Yeah.
Who will be voted off, actually, would be interesting to know. But I'm not going to ask the panel that question. So, I mean, talking about, you know, sort of practical ways of actually putting customers at the centre, the topic of community batteries came up before, and I think you know, it's very relevant at the moment. The federal government have a grant round open at the moment for about 58 community batteries, and another 342 to follow pretty quickly, from my understanding. Victoria's obviously got another 100 community batteries that they've announced, and other state governments clearly have programs underway. So, I mean, are community batteries, you know, an important part of actually putting people and households at the centre of the grid? Alex, did you want to talk
Well,
to that?
I think they can be, because I think it's about bringing people along with you. I mean, I don't think about it from a system point, like I'm not an engineer. I'm thinking more about like how do you enable a transition where you take people along with you? And there's obviously a huge amount of enthusiasm for that. People want to be part of that. They're sort of popping up all over the country. So rather than kind of seeing that as a problem, like how do you harness that and sort of bring that into the mix? You know, in terms of the sort of opportunity, the broader opportunity, I mean, I think it's really interesting that one of the first ones funded in Tasmania was in social housing. So, like, how do you take a broader lens on that, I suppose, is interesting to me. Yeah, I don't know what you think, Paul. I mean, I think in terms of the way we design our cities, in terms of like sustainable buildings, sustainable communities, they can be a really important part of that. Yeah.
We don't have the community storage concept yet. What we have had for some time is community solar, where you're allowed to, anybody can participate. You essentially get shares in that solar, and you get the energy off of it. It's credited against your, because the power doesn't actually flow that way, but it's a financial sort of arrangement for that energy. Batteries are now getting paired with that because there's more of a drive towards having more shaped energy coming from renewables, because we have too much, like in Calvin, we have way too much during the middle of the day.
Yeah.
So we're trying to shape that so the batteries are coming as part of the package. When that comes into the mix, and then the question is, oh, wait a minute, you pretty much have the building blocks for a microgrid capability, but we need to think about how you would configure the distribution network to be able to enable that for that particular part of the community. So it kind of leads in one step to the next as to how you then address resilience in addition to addressing the energy. A lot of this is around energy equity.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I think too. I think community batteries have got a really important role to play in energy equity and making some of the benefits of this energy transformation available more broadly, and not just to people who can afford to put their solar or buy themselves a Tesla, which is marvellous, but there are a lot of people not in that situation. So, you know, that's when I'm looking at the question, who's at most at risk of being excluded, and to me it's always the case with all of these transformations, people who are marginal, people who are on a low income, First Nations people, renters, you know, are much more at risk of being excluded from the benefits and the value that can be created, and more at risk of, for example, having poorer range of choices and options. And I think we all know that. And community batteries and solar gardens, or, you know, community gardens, they are all really interesting ideas for ways to create much greater equity as we go through the transformation. So I think they'll be really interesting, and we're looking to see the community battery program also looking at how it helps to support the distribution network in the low voltage network, and allow greater export of solar and greater participation of people who do have solar on their rooftop. So we're looking at it from a system point of view, but also from a community and equity point of view. We'll be very interested to see how it actually works and how it plays out. It's like a big experiment.
I think it's important to think about who and how community batteries are delivered. The model where perhaps a network owns all of the community batteries in the program may mean that there are few community benefits because the income is flowing to the DNSP and not necessarily into the community, whereas
Yes,
a
I agree.
community-led battery, there's more opportunities for the income from that battery to feed back to the community. So it's very important to think about how that model is rolled out and who owns the batteries.
And I think it'll be a very wide range of different models that gets rolled out. So what'll be interesting is to evaluate that and see what those benefits are and who they accrue to. So I think you're right. If they're all owned by transmission or distribution providers, you'll get a very different set of beneficiaries than if they're owned by communities. But I think you may find that there's more diversity in who benefits in all the models than we might just assume right from the start.
I mean, I think your point around equity is really important because, you know, if you look at, for example, you know, in the context of COVID, I know there was work done to look at which kids didn't have access to digital devices to do learning at school, and often they were the same people being impacted by flooding in a really significant way. So it's kind of the layering of, you know, the impacts of climate change and the access to services, and, you know, so I suppose that's why, from my perspective, if you don't focus on that, it's you know, it's a missed opportunity. So it's great to hear that people are thinking about it.
So I mean, you know, I think it's obvious to me why people are talking about networks deploying community batteries, not so much for the model, but because, you know, they have hundreds of electrical engineers just waiting there to do the modelling and analysis. How do community groups kind of skill up to the point where they can actually put up a credible application that's going to be you know, considered as feasible, when they may not have the specialist skills available to them to actually do that, and they're typically not operating at a scale that other organisations are operating at?
They're going to have to find their pet electrical engineer, Lachlan, and partner with, you know, people that know the market, the regulation. It's, as we've said, it's complex. So, as a community, when you're looking to develop a battery, you are going to need additional skills that you're going to have to probably go out and find, but you are very dependent on the distribution network service provider for the location of your battery, getting a connection for your battery, and at a suitable tariff for your battery. And so, you know, those are all difficult things that you have to negotiate. And as we've already said, it's very complicated. So you need experts, and you need a range of experts.
Absolutely. Other thoughts on that?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, you go, Paul. You'll know a lot more about it, I think.
Well, in the context of sort of the microgrid as an example, in California there's a $200 million US program for community microgrid to address vulnerable and disadvantaged communities. And as part of that, there was a process developed for how that money would get allocated, but part of that was to help communities on the front end identify their needs, their resilience needs, and to help them understand whether a community microgrid, which is a pretty complex undertaking and expensive, was the right solution, or maybe something more simple would address their need. But in the more complex, the network providers are engaging in the early stage to help with a little bit of consultation beyond what they would normally do through a solar interconnection process and the like, as well as helping the community understand what they may need in terms of engineering consulting support for the development of a project and a proposal to submit back for funding application. The funds come from a public good charge that's put on the wires charge it's funding this effort. It's also the same fund that covers energy efficiency and demand response programs in California. But that additional process there on the front end seems to be, and that was driven by feedback from community stakeholders through a stakeholder process. So this is all online too, if folks are interested. There's all this information's out there.
That's a great, great example of something that could be adopted here. So we're getting towards the end of the session. So there's two more topics I'd like to just touch on. So Lance has been waiting very patiently for his question to be answered. And so I'm just going to sort of open up discussion now. You know, we talk a lot about the assets that we're going to deploy as part of the transition, but I think sometimes what's less considered is, you know, how we actually connect them all, integrate them all, get them working in an efficient way, but also in a way that actually works for people. So we'd just like to open up a discussion around sort of that integration and interoperability piece. You know, how are we going on that front, and what can we learn from other jurisdictions globally?
Well, in the US, it's been a 10, 15-year process around interoperability. And most of the focus has been from consumer devices to the power system. There's been some focus on interoperability within the power system devices as we put new technologies into the grid. But a lot of this focus has been working through the international standards organizations and developing those standards and getting an agreement not just from the energy sector, but also the device manufacturers, because as you can imagine, trying to get all the autos to line up on what the EV charging standard should be, get the thermostat folks to line up on what that needs to be, get the solar folks to line up, the battery folks. Each of those has, you know, different issues, different considerations, including electrical panels and, you know, the circuit breakers and all that. So it's pretty extensive. A lot of that work has been done. Those standards are available, both sort of US-based standards, but also international as well, because this has also been going on in Europe as well and elsewhere. What's happening now over the last 5 years is those standards are starting to get incorporated into regulatory requirements, both for what the distribution network operators do in their interconnect. We have these interconnection standards in the U.S. For how advanced inverters and the like are needing to be incorporated, but it extends also to then the device provider, and you know, so on both upstream and downstream, if you will, in terms of what's going to be required. So we've kind of dealt with some of the physical. Now what's happening is we're dealing with the information and communication protocols on how we standardize the interfaces on that level so that devices can talk to each other. You can have standard interface between these devices to communicate to the utility or grid operators, because otherwise you'd end up with this mishmash of all kinds of different ways that the information is configured, and that's what's meant by a protocol in terms of communicating. So, you know, if you've got one speaking German and another one speaking English and another one speaking French, you can't, you know, you need to build these very complex translators to then, you know, deal with all this. And so that's all being standardized too through a set of standards. But we're also still dealing with the fact that some devices are using like Bluetooth, some devices are using Wi-Fi, some devices are connected directly to, you know, hardwired internet. So we've got those challenges as well, because not only those communication channels are always as reliable as you might otherwise think. So there's a lot of complication about how we get that out. But fundamentally, we've got the standards sort of worked out. Now it's just getting it flowing through the regulatory process and requirements.
Jill?
I guess for me, it's more about the communication than what goes on behind the communication. So, for instance, the internet is all about what happens at the interface, just as you were saying, because you just got to pass your information in a standard format. What happens with the information after that is up to the device manufacturer and smart people and innovators to play with. But for me, it's less about communicating with the grid. I'm more concerned about what happens when I buy a washing machine, a tumble dryer, an air conditioning system, and then I want a home energy management system. I want them all to work seamlessly together. I want them to plug and play, and I know it's a long time since I've had to talk about plug and play, but there's nothing more frustrating than trying to pair things together and trying to get them to work, and you want that to be easy and simple and not require someone to come in and help you or your 12-year-old son to show you how it's done. So, yeah, it's about ensuring not just communication externally, but all appliances can talk nicely to each other.
And interesting that the function of the energy system now depends on 12-year-olds.
Yeah, that's right.
Everything
I feel like
does,
the world's
doesn't
in
it?
safe hands.
I might mention you reminded me, the other interface that we think about is the consumer getting access to their own information. And in the US, there's a standard that was developed by the US Department of Energy called Green Button and Green Button Connect. And this is a way for consumers to be able to get their hourly data for, if you have a smart meter, hourly data, actually even greater granularity if the meter collects it, for the last couple of years. And it's available online, you can get it. But it's also available, you just push a button and you can have it sent off in an automated process to the provider that, say, a solar company, if you want to get an estimate or proposal on a solar or a battery or the like, they can get that file and then they can put your proposal together very quickly. So this Green Button Connect process is one, or method, this standard, is one that's been being implemented around the country.
Something that we desperately need for smart meter rollout, and there was a really great piece of work done on the UK situation by Mike Roberts, funded by ECA, that said if you don't have smart meters sharing the data in real time with customers, if they want it, they may not want it, but that opportunity has to be there, then a smart meter is really all about enabling the incumbents to stick around a bit longer. So, yeah, we haven't. I have a smart. Live from Victoria. I have a smart meter. I have two solutions. I have a Power Pal counting the blinking lights, and I have a clamp ammeter because I can actually get my real-time smart meter data. I've got to try and work around my smart meter in order to get access to that data.
And I wonder sometimes with collecting all the data whether it creates another real risk in terms of community confidence and trust, because recently we've had quite a few data hacking incidents, and people have lost access to a lot of their data, and some of them are still trying to get themselves another new number on their driver's license through the various events that we've had. So part of me sort of thinks there are consumers at that end who are really interested in managing their washing machine and interfacing their washing machine and everything, but then there's other people who really don't care, but just want to fundamentally be able to manage their electricity spend. And so there's such a diversity of all of us, but I really feel that the data collection is a huge risk in terms of community confidence if something goes wrong. Yeah.
We've got to a couple of minutes before the end of the session, and again, sort of turning our mind to what do we need to do next, and what's the call to action, the pragmatic steps that we can take to put people at the centre of the grid. I'd just like to give each of you sort of 30 to 45 seconds for your, what's the one action that we need to be taking, and maybe who needs to be taking that action to ensure that we do successfully integrate people and communities into the energy system that we're building.
Do you want me to go first? I'm happy to go first. I mean, there's lots of actions, but I think the one action that's right at the centre for the Commonwealth is building trust. And to do that, that involves, having honest conversations and keeping your word. So for us, that'll be first step as we seek to build the confidence of the community for this energy transformation.
Paul?
I think as part of that process, it kind of goes to one of the questions I see here, is it is essential to take a holistic approach. I don't think we want to be going to communities and consumers on a piecemeal basis. I think we need to have the whole picture and be able to have that holistic conversation as part of it. So I think holistic is really an essential element.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think, in the context of renewable energy zones, however many you do, the impacts of that are going to go beyond energy. So to sort of address the concerns around people and to enable them to shape the future for their place, I think you need to have a conversation about, what's the opportunity? Rather than them seeing it as something that's being done to them, like how do you empower them to kind of shape their future, both in the context of energy but also more broadly. And so like on a practical level, I think it's about, doing a pilot in the next res around that and seeing like how can we have a different conversation and then, moving from there.
So I'd like to see the industry, the Apple industry, start to talk about customers not as, oh, this is inevitable. The physics says this is inevitable and we're all going to have to, the customers are just going to have to do it. They're going to have to like it or lump it. That is not language that we should be using in our industry. We should be, talking respectfully about customers. And if there's a physics problem, then we need to be communicating the physics problem and talking about the possible solutions, not just, I've decided what that solution is and you're going to like it.
And I think that's a good full circle conversation. And I'm going to sort of frame this as the call to action for all of us, is really to think about an energy system or an apple market, as it were, where we don't have the big end of town trying to prune somebody else's apple tree. So with that, please join me in thanking Jill, Alex, Paul and Kirsty